Okay, I hope y'all enjoyed that as much as I do because it's one of my favorites. And again, I try and think about what is the appropriate music we should be having for Money Talks, and of course, it's going to be Pink Floyd. Anyways, I'm Burt Copeland with New Life CFO Services, and welcome to another edition of CFO Money Matters and our LinkedIn Live. We do this every month on usually the third Friday of every month. We had to move it to this Friday, so don't be confused. We just had a little bit of a hiccup that came up last week and a little bit of a medical emergency that caused us to pivot. But again, thanks for being here. And as you've gone through these series, if you've been with us for all this series, and a few of y'all actually have, thank you, but you'll see some repeated points. And we do that because not everybody's been here for everything. And there's certain points that we think are always worth mentioning again and again. So with that said, we're going to get started. I'm going to tell you what, today's topic is dashboards, metrics, trends, and KPIs. We're really focused about how do we make the data more meaningful for you and your team, right? Because if people are ever in your boardroom and they're looking at whatever metrics you have, whatever financial statements you're presenting, or whatever the case may be, and they're looking at it and they're not asking questions about it, or if they, more importantly, don't know that they own that number or they know what to do to change that number, then it's a problem. I actually had sitting in a boardroom one time, and the CEO was presenting numbers and everything else like that, and I was stunned that nobody was asking questions about it because they were showing cash receipts and cash disbursements, and disbursements were significantly bigger than the receipts week after week after week after week. And I said, is anybody going to ask a question about that? And they said, no, nobody hands went up. I says, y'all need to look at that number. Like every week that the disbursements is bigger, I want you to think about that number as though you are pulling money out of your wallet to solve that gap. So it's a big thing about owning the numbers. And I have found over my career that dashboards, KPIs help to connect those dots better than anything else, which is why we're spending so much time on it. So just as a recap, we've previously talked about why is it important to have metrics and how they do it. It's a little bit of what we just talked about that helps to connect the dots between different attributes in the financial statements, the balance sheet, and the income statement. But more importantly, and you're going to see this today, good metrics really help to connect the dots between your financial statements and the human behaviors behind them, right? Y'all have heard me talk about this before, and we're going to visit on that again. So today, it's not February 16th, obviously, but we are going to really focus on just the income statement analytics. So there's lots of balance sheet, liquidity analytics, and we're going to do those later on. With one thing I want to update y'all on, we're actually going to do the balance sheet metrics and exploring tools all together, but we're going to do that on April 19th. And why am I moving? Because we have something really cool coming up on March 15th. Myself and the Blender marketing agency, the Marketing Blender, they actually do our marketing. I'm sorry that that resolution is not quite as sharp as it should be. We're going to have a joint session March 15th, and it's really about driving your revenue strategy. Revenue is a tricky deal because most people think more is better, and we want to really dive into how valuable is your revenue and what do you do to really create a more valuable revenue stream. We're very excited about this. And yes, there's going to be some KPIs in this, but we're doing a little bit of pivot because we found in doing some of our surveys that a lot of y'all are already deep into the year and perhaps are not focused about how to create the best revenues. So that's what we're going to be doing with Dacia Coffee. And if y'all have not had the opportunity to meet Dacia, well, you just buckle up. If you think I'm engaging, she's like 10x whatever I do. Anyways, that's what we'll be doing on March 15th. Looking forward to you joining us at that point in time. Now, a lot of this comes from a series that we do about the Shark Tank. The series is actually called, Are Your Numbers Ready for the Shark Tank, or are you just chumming the water? You may have seen that on the first slide. And what's the universal truth about Shark Tank when you watch that show? And I'm sure most of y'all watch the Shark Tank for the profit. Well, if you sit back and reflect for just a little bit, one of the biggest things that they chime in about or really get on the entrepreneur about is, A, you don't even know your numbers. Like somebody doesn't know their revenue. They don't know what their bookings are. They don't know how many customers they have. You don't know your revenues. You don't know your cash flow. You don't know your profitability, whatever. The other thing that they really get on there, the people who are presenting, is you don't know what your numbers are telling you about your own business, which puts the entrepreneur at a distinct advantage because the sharks all clearly know what those numbers are telling or should be telling you about your business, and the entrepreneur doesn't. We find that metrics are a good way to short circuit that, to connect those dots faster, because entrepreneurs, it helps them to see things in the financials that, if you're like me and you've been playing with financials for decades, you start to see the relationships pretty easily on a spreadsheet or set of financials. Average entrepreneur and the average people in your C-suite are not built that way. So that's where the metrics really become very, very important. As far as the metrics, let me get this out of the way here. Sorry about that. It's a little distracting. It'll move right back up. We want you to always remember that your financials, your metrics, whatever you're measuring in your business, are just a historical reflection of your people, their decisions, behaviors, and then your processes and systems. That's really important because your numbers need to resonate with your people so that they can connect between what they're doing and what numbers they're affecting. And really, for your CFO or somebody in your boardroom, their job is to connect those dots between how these behaviors affect the financials. So if you really want to change your financials, you need to understand what behaviors need to change and how your people own the metrics and or own their own individual numbers as you assign them out. And yeah, we do believe that's very important to assign out certain metrics for so that somebody knows that they have accountability. They know when they leave your boardroom that it's their job to go and change that number. And then hopefully when they come back in at the next board meeting, they know that they're going to be presenting, in addition to the CFO or controller, about what's going on with that number. What have they done to change it? And what are the expected outcomes? For a lot of y'all that are in EOS, these would become rocks or issues or IDSs that people, not issues or IDSs, issues and to-dos, so that somebody walks away with the responsibility to go change a behavior. I hope this makes sense to you, because if you get this concept, it is mind-blowing what that will do to your company. And just the small stuff matters. An example that I've given several times is a company that did software installations, right? They would install the software, they get it up and running, they would do some custom programming to make sure that it was working well, working as intended, right? And they had 50 technicians that were responsible for engaging the clients like this. But their profits were below average, not just low, but below average. And so the thing that I always ask when I see below average numbers, I'll ask the owner or the leadership team or the company, whoever's involved, it's like, do you think that you truly have below average product or service? No. Okay. Do you think you're below average people? No. Okay. So something in your company between great people and probably a great product is producing below average results. So in this case, one thing that we asked about was, hey, look, for your 50 technicians, how many of y'all do 2 hours of work each week that maybe could have been billed for, but you're like, teeing that up as a billable item, it's kind of a hassle. I'm just going to step right over there and keep going. All 50 raised their hand, right? All 50. So 50 times 2 equals 100 hours a week times 50 weeks. So that's 5,000 hours in a year times their bill rate of $250 to $300 an hour. Well, when you do the math on that, it actually ended up increasing their profitability by double. Why? Because that money drops straight to the bottom line. Now, the key of why I'm ranting on this is because changing that little human behavior about capturing those 2 hours doubled the profitability of that company. So if we can teach your people how the metrics and the key metrics help them to understand how their behaviors and activities affect your numbers, you might be very surprised that you too could have a doubling of your profitability. So as we go through this, we're going to be focused on the income statement today. And my favorite metaphor of an income statement is a sandwich. In fact, I ask CEOs all the time, it's like, tell me what you look at when you get your financials. And universally, they'll say, I look at revenue and I look at EBITDA. Great. I tell them that you just looked at the two pieces of bread there on the left. You looked at the top slice and the bottom slice. But again, it's all the stuff in the middle on the right that makes a sandwich interesting. Nobody buys a sandwich just for the bread. There's some really good bread out there, but primarily it's the stuff in between. The same thing is true with your income statement. And what really makes the tomato or whatever really juicy is when you start connecting those components of your income statement to the underlying activity. This series is going to be a little bit different because we're actually going to play with some dashboards so you can see how these trends could change certain companies. So I'm kind of geeked up about that we're going to be doing that. For some of y'all, and this is available, take a picture of this, right? Because these are some of my favorite income statement metrics. This is just tip of the iceberg, right? Tip of the iceberg. So go ahead and take a picture of this. And then if you want to, send me a request either in this chat or whatever, put your email address in there. And we'll not only send you these metrics, we'll send you also a spreadsheet about how to calculate them. And then an explanation document that says, this is what you should be learning from these metrics. So first and foremost, we have composition of revenue and concentration. A lot of people, like when I had in my construction company, bigger was better. Not necessarily, because in my construction business, I had project revenue, like I'd go out and do a big project, and then I had maintenance revenue. Guess which one of those was really big? That was my project revenue. Guess which one of those was really important and valuable? That was my service revenue. Why? Because my service revenue repeated every month, whether I sold it again or not. The projects, they only win if I sold it. Therefore, my revenue composition was incredibly important as to the value of my company. Making sure you don't have concentration risk is very, so these are things that we can measure and develop metrics on and monitor over time. So you'd want to see that your favorable revenue composition is getting bigger and bigger. Revenue per head, one of my favorite metrics of all time. Why? Because it really helps to balance your most fluid costs with your underlying activity, which is revenue. Another one that we'll look at a little bit is gross profit per unit and or gross profit per admin head. That's supposed to be admin with an M and not an N. I don't know how that didn't get caught, but it is what it is. So what does that tell you? It tells you how productive you're being for the things that are not up in COGS. Very important. Direct labor and direct materials percent of revenue. You might even look at direct labor heads or revenue per direct labor heads. It's a really easy number to understand. My people are being more productive. It's taking me less people to do more revenue, or the same amount of people are doing more revenue. And I will guarantee you, when you monitor revenue per head or revenue per direct labor head, if that's improving, I almost guarantee you that your profitability and your gross margins are improving. Break even. I love break even as a metric, right? I love it. Here's why. It tells me so much about the company, because within break even is a revenue number, is my gross margin, and it's my cost structure. So how you calculate break even is you're going to take your total operating expense, which is your SG&A, your sales, general and administrative expenses, and you're going to divide that by your gross margin percent. What that does is it tells you how much revenue you need to cover all of your operating expenses. The reason that I think it's really great is you can play wicked cool games with break even. For example, if you just say, what if I just raised my margin 3 or 4 points, right? What you're going to see is, whoa, your break even point comes way down for small changes. And when your break even point comes down, you know what that's telling you? The risk of your business is coming down. It's getting easier for you to make money. Here's another way that I love to use break even, and we've talked about this on a few of the previous deals. If I'm also have a sales team that has a sales manager, I want them to know my break even point. And then I'll ask them, do you have enough new business coming in so that this next month, not February, so that March, we have enough business to meet or exceed our break even point? If they're consistently getting good at making sure we have enough business 1 month out, then ultimately I'll ask them the same question for 2 months out and then for 3 months out. Because if we can get 90 days down the road and have enough prospects in our pipeline or in our RFP pool to constantly ensure that we're going to be break even or better, it's stunning what that does to your bottom line. Because every gross margin dollar above your break even goes straight to the bottom line, straight to the bottom line. So knowing where that is very important. Customer acquisition cost. If you watch Shark Tank, you see this all the time. I almost said Star Trek, so it may be Yoda was telling me off. But if you watch it, they're constantly asking about what is your customer acquisition cost. And this is really important because it's telling you how effective your marketing is. Are you hitting the right people with the right messages that says, buy this now? And when you monitor it over time, if your customer acquisition cost goes down, even though you're spending the same amount of marketing, that's telling you that you have now hit the jackpot. Whatever you were doing to drive that number down, that metric down, while your marketing spend is still the same, that means that you need to pour gas on whatever that is and just do a whole lot more of it, because you're going to be printing money at that point in time with a flood of new customers. Over time, that'll change because one tactic will kind of ebb and flow. Number of months of revenue and backlog are in your pipeline. I'm just going to say backlog for right now. I come from a construction background. So every month I want to see how much revenue do I have in my backlog. For y'all that are not familiar with backlog, what backlog is I've won the contract, right? So I have it in-house, there's ink on paper, and it's worth $100,000. But I've only done $25,000 worth of that work, or I've only billed $25,000 worth of that work. Therefore, 75,000 equals what's in my backlog of work waiting to be done. I hope that makes sense. So in my construction business, I always wanted 3 months of 3 to 4. I always wanted 4 months of revenue in my backlog. And why was 4 months important? Because my sales cycle was 3 months. So if I always had 4 months of revenue in my backlog, I knew that I was okay. I knew that I could consistently rebuild that backlog, and I was not going to be in stress about having inadequate sales. Now, what's really interesting is if my number of months of revenue and backlog got to be 5 or 6 months, I had tons of cushion. I could go out and go elephant hunting at this time, and I could expend the efforts on getting the really big new customer because I didn't have to be playing Moneyball all the time. And if you watch that movie Moneyball, it's just, I just need to get somebody on base. I need to get somebody on base. But if I'm always getting people on base, then maybe I can put that person up there that's willing to hit a home run. Conversely, if my number of months of revenue and backlog goes to 3, which is right at my sales timeline, right? My sales cycle, or if it went to 2, wow, that's bad news. Because now I've depleted it so fast that I may not be able to eat well 2 months from now. So what does that tell me? It tells me I need to maybe lower some pricing on some jobs to bring in some revenue so I can keep my staff busy, even if it takes some margin to do so. Now, as we go through this, KPIs and metrics really tell you what decisions should be made. Just like I talked about with the technology company, that decision is I need to capture the 2 hours per week that I'm working for free, that I'm working and not billing somebody. And other things, it may be revenue per head. It's telling me my revenue per head is usually $20,000 a month, just say. And it gets up to $25,000 per month. Well, that's telling me it's probably time to hire somebody before, because if it gets to 27 or 30, I'm stressing my people out. They're going to go crazy. So good metrics, when you understand what they're telling you, tell you to take action. Conversely, if my revenue per head is normally 20 and it goes down to 17 or 18, then it's like, I'm going to pause on hiring. I could let attrition take its course, right? If it goes down to 15, maybe that's my trigger for when I need to let people go. But the numbers, when well designed, will tell you what behaviors to be taking. Now, as we develop metrics, comparisons of just metrics over time, just like our income statement, are very important. A single metric of itself is not all that useful. You have to have comparison. Now, for a lot of y'all, the most ready comparison is going to be what's in your budget or how has this metric been trending over time? That's a really great deal. If you're fortunate enough to have benchmark studies, like you're in a trade association and you have good benchmarks about how the average bear performs in your industry, that's fantastic too. If you don't have a good benchmark deal, later on, I'll show you what we use and you could either subscribe to it, or if you're curious, send us a text or email and I'll let you know if we already have that benchmark. And if we do, I'm happy to share some of that information with you. So having these comparisons and when they change enables us to ask good questions about why. So if I saw gross margin at 35%, and that's all I see is a single number at 35%, is that good or bad? Well, I don't know. For some businesses, that would be outstanding. For other businesses, that's awful. Like if I'm a makeup manufacturer and reseller, that's awful, awful. I want a margin of like 80%, sometimes 90%. Now, if I was in my construction business, and if I had a gross margin of 35%, that's fantastic. That's 10 points better than the average bear of 22 to 25%. So it depends. That way, if we look at that 35% over time, so let's go back to my construction business. I was happy at 25%. But if I saw my trend was going up towards 35%, I'm getting happier and happier because it's also telling me a couple of really important things about my business. I'm going to skip around here because I'm on margins and kind of on a flow for margins. Let's talk about margins real quick. What do gross margins really tell me? As my margins continually improve, it's telling me that I'm consistently executing my work. It's also telling me as my margins get bigger, it's telling me that my company is becoming less risky. It's also telling me some important things about my culture. But if I have a company like in this one where my margins are bouncing all over, like this gentleman kind of pointing at his margins bouncing all over, I call that a margin migraine. It's telling you something very important about your business. It's one of three things. Number one, your proposals and estimates are jacked up relative to how the work is actually done. Somebody's mispricing them, misestimating the quantities, or whatever. Because one month you had something that was estimated really good, margins were great. The other month, the estimate was awful and you spent a lot more money and that margins tank. So when your margins are bouncing all over the place, they're really high, they're not consistent, perhaps your proposal and estimating function is jacked up. Number two, when your margins are bouncing all over the place, it's also telling that your operations and your execution is not going well. One month, or Burt as the leader on the job really jacked it up and he did more of the work, so your margins tank. Then Susie was the project manager on another job and she's fantastic. And those margins were great in the next month. So your margins bouncing all over the place can also tell you that you have inconsistent ability to execute the work. That could be people, that could be communication, and that could be processes. So here's one interesting deal about what is the root cause when those things are going on. So I usually step back and says, you know what? When changes happen, whether it's the ops execution or proposal, and those things are going all over the place, I ask myself, what's more likely? Did a person change? Did a process change? Or did a system change? If you just ask you that question, you'll quickly determine what your root cause is and narrow that down real quick. The other thing that a margin migraine and any headaches will tell me is that my dance partnership between operations and accounting is jacked up. That communication is not fluid. They're not serving each other well. Perhaps they see each other as the antithesis of joy. So when that happens, that miscommunication is all over the board, you're going to have a deal to where one doesn't trust the other. And when that happens, the reliability of the numbers becomes less and less. And even if the numbers are great, if there's that mistrust, then the operations people still don't believe it because that's not what they want to hear. There's one thing that I didn't put on here that your margins, especially, let's say that they're stable, but they're either increasing or decreasing. So, or just really high and low. Let's go with high and low. So really high margins, you know what that's also an indicative of? Or that you'll see in companies with really high margins? generally a really good culture. It's a flexible culture where people are engaged, and it's a learning environment. And why do margins affect that? Because my margins are nice and big. So if I make a mistake in executing the job, it's okay. It's not going to kill the month. We can learn from that. We can digest it. We can root cause it, and we can make it eliminated going forward. But if my margins are really small, you know what that company looks like? Autocratic hell, in my opinion. Autocratic hell because they can't afford any mistakes. So looking at that gross margin and how that percent, it's one of the key metrics. Monitoring that over time is fantastic. Monitoring metrics for your different lines of business is even better, because you may find out that one business is subsidizing the other, and that's never good. So as we go back up here, one thing that we talk about is not all revenues are created equal. So earlier on, when we were looking at some of my favorite income statement metrics, we were talking about the composition of revenue. Again, in my company, the project revenue was not nearly as valuable as the recurring maintenance and service revenue. And I think the stats prove out to where project revenue is worth only, or let me flip this around, that service and repeating or recurring revenue is worth 7 times what project revenue is. So in my company, if I could ever get my service revenues to be 20% of my total revenue mix, I would have been worth a fortune. Unfortunately, we got to about 5 or 7%, so not quite a fortune, but it was still a nice, healthy deal that eliminated the dips month to month. But as we talk about not all revenues are created equal, we've gone over this before between low risk revenues and high risk revenues. But here's my question. Are you measuring the composition of your revenue? Do you know what percent may be in some form of recurring revenue? And there's this unique thing that I call reoccurring revenue. That's important too. So not even all projects are created equally. So if you have, the example I've used before is back in the day when they were building cell towers. Well, each cell tower was a project, but there was hundreds of thousands of cell towers that needed to be built. So if you're good at it, you had reoccurring revenue that would go on for years. That's much more valuable than just project revenue, right? And then we get down into consumables and everything else. So are you measuring the valuable attributes of your revenue? This is what Daisy and I are really going to dive into on March 15th. And boy, does she rip the Band-Aid off on this, and then get into tactics about how to make sure that you are building for a more valuable revenue stream. Now, here's a few before we start playing with some of our metrics and dashboards. This one is gross profit and break even. So you can say break evens in the purple and gross profits up top. Now, what I want you to see is how break even was getting higher and higher and higher. It was getting close to 4.7, 4.8 million. And down here, it was only 3 million. So how much harder does your team have to work to cover 4.5 million versus just 3 million? Well, obviously it's 50%, right? They have to work 50% harder just because the gross profits went down. So that's really hard to improve 50%. And what's interesting is when the break even comes down, look, the real reason that the break even goes down is because they became much more sensitive as to how they are pricing their relationships. And the more that they move their pricing up, especially from this long-term history where it was, 35 to 38%, and they went above this 40%, look at how low the risk profile is for this company. Risk profile being in their break-even point. So, and just as a coincidence for this company, their revenues were actually going up during this period, not down, because they decided that pricing was going to get them to the right customers. They got rid of the customers that were causing a bunch of pain, allowed them to more consistently execute, and they reduced the risk profile of their company by increasing their margins. Here's another one of my favorites. Gross profit per head versus compensation per head. And this is really measuring the productivity of the people who are not in direct labor. This helps you to understand, do you have administrative problems and you're just throwing bodies at the problem, right? You might be throwing compensation, like you've hired a lot of really expensive people. But looking at your gross profit per head versus your compensation per head will really help you to understand, am I diluting my profitability? This is telling me that this company had serious process issues. Because back here, they were making $10,000 per head difference between gross profit and the average comp. In this case, we're just going to look at the two trailing 12 numbers, the light blue and the yellow. When we're getting down here, well, that $10 spread is only 4. It's only 3, and then it stays at 3. 3 is not good, right? In these periods, they were losing money. It was hard. And what they quickly, once we showed this to them, is like, oh my gosh, we have to go find the root cause. And once they spent about a quarter finding the root cause, they corrected it, and quickly this trend reversed. But without identifying how unproductive their back office and administrative functions were becoming, they were just continuing to throw more bodies because the people were walking into the boardroom going, we had this huge problem. It's a mess. It's jacking up everything. I need more people. Go on and on and on. So here's one thing that's really interesting. We've talked about revenue per head. Is that my next slide? No. We've talked about revenue per head though. So here's a great way to weaponize revenue per head. Problems are going on. People are complaining. I need more people to solve these problems. So let's say that your revenue per head is $25,000 a month. Fantastic, I guess. And somebody comes in and says, hey, look, boss, I need 3 more people because this log jam is not getting unjammed. And you're like, fantastic. Just help me understand, how many months are these people going to be on board until we have $75,000 a month more in revenue? They're like, what? Well, we average revenue per head of 25,000. You want 3 people, which means at some point in the future, we need to have revenue per head that is $75,000 more. Now you may be able to pivot this into EBITDA per head, but it doesn't matter because now you're challenging your people that they have to be a part of right sizing the company when they're adding more cost to it. Cost should be a part of an investment profile, not a problem profile, right? Think about that. You invest in people for an investment profile, not a problem profile. If you get into the slippery slope of investing in people because you have problems, don't be surprised if your problems become permanent, and so does your very low margins in EBITDA. So step back. This is a great signal that's telling you that you have a problem, and go solve the problem. Don't go solve the people. Okay. So as we move through here, y'all have all seen ITR. It's one of my favorite deals. And this really helps us to understand when your individual business is going into a recession. This is 12 over 12 and 3 over 12. So with that, we're now at the, let's go have some fun with this. In this case, the 12 over 12 and 3 over 12 was saying that this company was going into a recession. In fact, this has continued for the last 5 months. They've been going towards a recession. It looks like they're going to start pulling it up now, but monitoring this helps you to plan future obligations and expenses. With that, I'm going to move some stuff around here because I really wanted to spend some time with y'all today playing with some metrics. Let me pull up some of my favorite metrics on another spreadsheet, and then I'll move it up to here. So bear with me for just a second. I apologize because I thought I had this already pulled up and I don't see it. This is a bad way to run a webinar, if you will, but here we go. There they are. Okay. So we're going to go live with a couple of renditions about how we use metrics and everything else. This is our wheel of performance. We have some clients that call it the wheel of dread because there's too much red on it. But in this case, we only have the income statement metrics. I'm going to move my little picture out of the way here so we can focus on what's going on. And we will do this between operating. In this case, this is a freight company. The name of this company is Freight RS. I know, very clever, right? Very, very original. I get it. But what's interesting here is we're not only looking at standard profitability metrics, like what is our gross profit, and we have a target. We always want a target for whatever metric you have, because that way you know if you're trending to or away from the target, how much you're above the target. You always want a target, whether that's your budget or industry benchmark, it doesn't matter. So we have very standard ones like, okay, our gross profit, our net income percent. I don't know why anybody'd have a target as negative, but they're expecting some stress or whatever. So we had the very traditional ones, but I want you to look up here. So on here, we have line haul revenue per mile. We have total revenue per mile. Why is this important? Now we are connecting your income statement to underlying activity that you have in your company. So just knowing that you had more revenue doesn't tell you if you're doing it more effectively. So in this company, they really wanted to measure, and here's another great one: driver payroll per mile. Are my drivers more productive or are they less productive? Now I could really get into this and say, okay, 0.9, 0.92. And over time, we could challenge the person who's managing the drivers. What do we have to do to get this to 0.93, 0.94, 0.95, which is really productivity measures? But it's also then saying, okay, as we expand our network, and we now they'll know that we're going to have X thousands of miles more to drive every month, every day, every whatever. Knowing this metric implicitly tells us when we need to hire, right? It tells us how many more drivers we're going to need. Just because we now know how many more miles we're going to have, we can instantly transition that back into, okay, that means we have to have X number of new drivers, and vice versa. We lose a big route, but we want to maintain our miles per driver. We now kind of have a measure that tells us approximately how many drivers we need to get rid of and still maintain our profitability. And then we get into active truck average, ending truck count. So we're starting to really get into the operational side, the attributes that drive the performance. So it's really important to step back when you're looking at your income statement. Ask yourself, what are the attributes that really drive the performance for that line item? And if I understand that, then are there metrics that tell me I'm okay or not okay? So just knowing that I have driver expense in a distribution business doesn't tell me a whole lot. It may tell me something if I have driver expense as a percent of revenue. Now I have some relationships going on, right? And then if I have driver expense per mile or per delivery, that too is very important, especially if you see it on a per delivery and my driver expense is going up and up and up per delivery. It may mean that you're not charging enough for deliveries, that you're having to go further for your deliveries. Where if I measure it on a driver per mile, I'll see that kind of smooth out. But the driver per delivery, driver cost per delivery, tells me something different. So when you look at the lettuce, the tomato, the cheese, and everything else in your income statement, think what activities are driving this? What's a different way that I can measure that so I can monitor are they becoming more productive, and how aligned is this with my revenue? So alignment with revenue, that would be direct labor as a percent of revenue. That would be my material, direct materials as a percent of revenue. And it may be some other items. We recently did for a company, we looked at their product lines because their margins were slipping. And so we looked at, for their top 50 items, we looked at what was going on cost per unit, because they constantly had more stuff coming in and everything else. And what we found is some of their cost per units were increasing, and they thought they had firm commitments with their vendors, but their vendors were increasing costs. And then the added costs were being overridden in the AP system. It's like, whoa, we had a change order. We had a purchase order for $100 per ton, but it came in at 105 or 106, and somebody was overriding that and paying more without the alarms going off. We also looked at the exact same thing about their inbound freight per unit. And that's where it got crazy, because people were putting in freight surcharges, fuel surcharges, and everything else. And their freight had gone through the roof relative on a per unit basis. So how are they using that? Now they're going back to select vendors and they're going to negotiate with them. Hey, for X period of time, we're going to agree that the freight surcharge is X and only X, and you don't change it. Now, it may change over time, and that's okay, as long as you know it's changing, right? Because if you know it's changing, you have two things that you can do now. I can go negotiate with other providers of that product or service and see if they can come up with a better answer than this higher freight. Or I now know to pass that along, right? So I'm not taking a margin dilution just because I'm caught by surprise. I can now make proactive decisions if I'm monitoring what this is doing over time. So as we look at some of these things, we have overall mileage and everything else. We can look at it slightly differently. So we like to do this all the time in that for every result, we want to have a target. And then this checkbox says that we met or exceeded the target. And these arrows say we're trending above the target or we're still trending below the target. So like on this one, gross profit per mile, the company is certainly doing better than target. Sorry, I got something in the way here. And they're still trending up. So if we look at that, we can see it's still trending up overall. And here's our target level. That target's 0, so that's not really a good one. But let's go up here as far as gross margin. They're doing well and they're trending up. So that's good too. So let's go to one of my other companies that I like here. So in this case, we have Sample Distribution Company. So we have all kinds of metrics here and some of my favorites. We have revenue per head, 33,032. So they're doing better than that, but let's look at how it's been going over time. Ooh, so it's only recently that they came back above. This overall trend means that they were having problems. And possibly, this is a really slippery slope here. People start making hiring decisions based upon future revenue. Not good, not good. Unless you can hold your people accountable and you want 3 more people, tell me when my revenue gets increased by $75,000. This tells you that they started to have staffing problems. And yes, they've now corrected it. December in this business is a little bit of an anomaly because they shut down during the holidays. So yes, there's less. But these other months still tell you that they systemically had a problem and they need to be very careful of their future revenue relative to their future hiring plans, or else they're going to continually squeeze their profitability. Now, as we go through this, there's tons of things that we could be doing with this company that we could look at things over a longer period of time. So I talked about the importance of gross profit margin. So let's look at the gross profit margin here over time. So as we're looking at this, I'm not going to go back all the way to the recession, right? This is the pandemic back here for this company. But you can see that their gross profit margin would be as low as 32%. It's gotten as high as 45+%, with some dipping down. So as we look at this, let's take away revenue, and then we're going to look at what's that doing to their break-even point, right? So we can see that there's an inverse relationship now because their margins have been going down, their break-even's going up, so it's harder and harder for them to succeed. They have to sell more. Do their salespeople realize that, hey, the budget you had in place of if you do 100 grand a month, that's what was in your budget and your goal, that's okay? It's no longer okay. This person needs to be told that they need to sell $120,000 a month and not 100. So again, as we have metrics and we connect those metrics to human behavior, we can change the metrics. So on this, it'd be really important for your sales manager to understand how these things ebb and flow. Now, if I went up here, I'm going to go up to settings. We use this tool on every client, every client. We actually have 110 companies that are on here. Now, I obviously can't show you real companies, but we have 110, and that allows us to have a great view of other companies in the exact same market that might be in a similar business and start finding best practices. Really important. So I'm going to go over here to settings, and we're going to look at KPIs. Now, we have just 16 selected, but in this case, you can see the KPIs that I turned off. right? There's a boatload of KPIs I could turn on or off depending on where they are showing. We only focused on the income statement items, revenue per head, revenue per direct labor head, EBITDA per head, uh, and on and on. But you can see that depending on what's going on with your company, we have a wide myriad of metrics that we can do. What we typically do is we're going to look at a lot of these to start out, and we're going to define the ones that are most impactful, that are either signaling that the company's in trouble and we need to take action, or signaling that the company is really healthy and we need to pour gas on the really healthy part to make it grow even faster. So that's one of the things that we like to look at. Now, if we go back to our analysis, then at some point we can play what if with some of our metrics. So let's go down here. Gross profit margin. So this is just real simple. So, hey, increasing pricing, what does that do? And usually pricing is much, or is it easier for me to increase pricing or reduce my variable costs? Which one will affect this percentage the most? So here's one thing that's really interesting. How many of y'all live in fear of your own pricing? A lot of people do. If you're struggling for your gross margin percent to do it, I want you to seriously consider raising your pricing. Every year, you're going to be paying your direct labor or your employees more, so you have upward push on your price. Every year, you're probably, especially the last 6 years, you're going to be paying more for your product. So you need to be sensitive about how your items are going and move your pricing up. The great thing about pricing is when you move your pricing up, 100% drops to the bottom line, goes straight down there. So if you want to look at fast ways to improve your profitability, if you can negotiate a reduced cost with your vendors, hallelujah, right? But pricing is something that you almost absolutely control. If you'd like, again, send me a text and we can give you the tools that will show you, is it safe to increase pricing? And that's a balancing act between how much you want to increase your pricing and what percent of your customers do you think you might lose if you raised your prices? For most companies, that's stunningly small. So I'm going to go back, and because we're basically down to the Q&A session, the last thing that I'll say, and we touched base on this a little bit, no matter what KPIs you're using, have a target, because your target is really telling you if the canary in the coal mine is screaming at you. So when you have your targets, establish them up front so that you know we want 40% gross margin up front. So instead of you looking at 35 to 37, so, oh, that's good. It went up 2 points. Like, no, that's not good. It's still not 40. The canary is telling you it's not good because that's the number you agreed to up front. So with that said, the last thing I'll show you, this is what we use for a lot of our benchmark reports. It's a BizMiner. It's a service that you can subscribe to if you have a lot of different companies. Or if you want, again, send us an email, throw it in the chat box, whatever. We'll be happy to provide you with benchmarks if we already have them downloaded and everything else. With that said, I'm going to turn the microphone over and see if there's anything that y'all would like to talk about that we have not already covered. I'm putting everybody's pictures up here so we can see them all and just have all the fun we'd like. Leslie, good to have you on board again. Some new faces this time, so that's always great. Do y'all have any favorite metrics that y'all like that we didn't talk about that have been really meaningful for you and your company and how that affects human behavior in your company? Okay. Well, if there's no questions, oh, somebody popped something in the chat. Guess I should have been. Oh, my favorite, Miss Leslie is asking a question. Orders per month processed. Wow. I love that. I love that. So Leslie, if you want to turn off your mic and kind of describe for everybody how y'all use that, I think that'd be really good.
Sure. Hi. Well, one of the things in our industry that we see is that from an administration and accounting standpoint, it takes as much time and effort for a very small order to be processed as a very large order. It takes the same amount of admin, customer service, logistics, accounting. So one of the things that we started really paying attention to was particularly during times of inflation and deflation, because gross top line revenue and even margins can change drastically, yet we're processing the same amount of orders. We're growing right now. So January was in December, we're very, very busy. The team was very, very stretched. And when we went back and looked at number of orders processed, we were up 30% just on the number of orders processed, even if the revenues and the margins weren't showing it, because it has to do with the number that they process versus just the value.
I love that. Thank you for bringing that up because, that's really critical. We're lucky that Leslie is on a lot of these things. So she knows a lot of my talking points. In fact, she probably could have repeated half a dozen of them. But having that insight, Leslie, that's fantastic because, we get back into not all revenue is created equal. Because in a lot of industries, like in my old construction company, it took me just as long to do the paperwork on a small job as it did a big job every month. So Leslie, thanks a ton because that's very valuable insight about some of the things that are really diluting our profitability, even if we're just looking at that top piece of bread that says revenues are still fine. Anyone else? Okay. Well, I hope this means that everybody is already focused on what a great weekend they're going to have. And I'm hoping that's all come true. As just as a reminder, let me get some stuff. Next time, we are going to be having a great conversation about your revenues with Dacia Coffee of the Marketing Blender, and she's amazing to talk to. She's one of my favorite people in the world and very insightful about what does it take to really build a more valuable company by focusing on building a more valuable revenue stream. With that, I'm going to let everybody go. We're down to, we're actually wrapping up 4 minutes early, which is rare for me, but I hope y'all are getting ready to have a fantastic weekend and y'all take care. Thank you very much. See you next time.